The villagers of Kamal Kel had learned to fear the dark long before the Americans ever arrived in Afghanistan. For years, the night had belonged to warlords, Taliban patrols, and the quiet knock on a wooden door that meant a son, a cousin, or a rival would vanish before sunrise. Yet as the war in Afghanistan dragged into its second decade, a new kind of fear began to spread through the valleys. Not of bearded men in sandals with battered rifles, but of helicopters that floated silently above the clouds and of shadows that moved with American discipline and American technology. In the early years after 2001, Afghan warlords had mocked the idea that foreigners could hold this rugged land. They remembered the Soviets crushed by the same mountain passes and believed the Americans would tire and leave just as quickly. What they did not understand was that the United States brought something entirely different to these remote districts: the ability to own the night with precision, intelligence, and a patience that turned darkness itself into a weapon. Far from the villages, inside brightly lit operation centers on American bases, giant screens glowed with live drone feeds and satellite imagery of Afghan valleys that most U.S. soldiers would never see in daylight. Names, phone numbers, and patterns of life of suspected Taliban commanders were compiled into target lists that updated almost in real time. When intelligence pointed to a meeting in some mud-walled compound miles from any paved road, the Americans rarely waited for morning. They began planning a night raid. For the Afghan warlords who had risen from the chaos of the 1990s, this was something new and deeply unsettling. They had built their power on the assumption that darkness would always hide them, that they could move fighters, weapons, and cash between villages while coalition aircraft slept on distant airfields. Now, whispered stories spread through their networks, of helicopters that appeared without warning, of doors blown in by silent teams with green glowing eyes, and of commanders dragged away in minutes while their guards were still searching for their sandals. On one cool autumn evening, a U.S. Special Operations Task Force gathered on a forward operating base not far from the Tangi Valley. In a plywood briefing room, an American major stood before a projected satellite image of Kamal Kel, the village sprawled along a dry riverbed. His voice was calm as he pointed to a compound marked in red, the suspected safe house of an Afghan warlord who had been coordinating roadside bomb attacks against U.S. convoys for months. Around him, a mix of American Special Forces soldiers and elite Afghan commandos studied the map. The Americans brought night vision goggles, encrypted radios, and aircraft on standby. The Afghans brought language, local knowledge, and the quiet determination of men who had chosen to fight beside the United States rather than bend to the Taliban. It was an alliance built in the shadows, but one that terrified the warlords who had long ruled these valleys by fear alone. The major explained the plan with the precision of someone who had done this many times. A drone already circled high above Kamal Kel, watching for armed men on rooftops or unusual movement in the streets. 2 helicopters would insert the main assault force outside the village, while a smaller blocking team moved to cut off escape routes toward the mountains. Overhead, an American gunship would orbit in the darkness, unseen but ready to intervene if the warlords' fighters chose to stand and fight. To the Afghan warlord inside that compound, the night seemed safe. He believed his informants would warn him long before any government troops or Taliban rivals drew near, and he trusted the thick mud walls that had protected his family for generations. He had heard rumors of American night raids in distant districts, of commanders snatched from their beds, but he told his men that such stories were exaggerated propaganda. After all, he asked, how could foreigners possibly find one man in a maze of villages spread across endless mountains? On the American base, the answer was displayed in neat rows of data. Weeks of intercepted phone calls showed who the warlord contacted after each attack. Drone footage revealed that whenever a certain Toyota pickup arrived in Kamal Kel, the attacks along the nearby highway increased 2 days later. A captured courier had confirmed the warlord's name and described the layout of his home, down to the courtyard where he liked to smoke under the stars. All that information, gathered by machines and human sources, now converged on one point: a rectangle of white on the satellite image marked as the objective. As the sun finally slipped behind the jagged Afghan ridgeline, the base shifted into its nighttime rhythm. Mechanics checked rotors and engines under red lights, loading helicopters with ammunition and fuel. Armor-clad soldiers marched toward the flight line, their silhouettes sharp against the dim glow of the hangars. Inside each helicopter, seats were lined with Americans and Afghans, their faces almost identical behind night vision goggles and darkened eye protection. For the American troops, night offered a familiar kind of comfort. They trained for this environment, moving confidently with technology that turned darkness into a green-tinted day. For the Afghan commandos beside them, the night was their homeland seen through new eyes. Valleys they had crossed countless times now appeared in ghostly detail on the screens of American pilots. Together, they formed the spearhead of a strategy designed to keep pressure on the Taliban and their allies, hunting them when they felt safest. Miles away, Kamal Kel settled into its usual uneasy sleep. Generators coughed and went silent one by one as families doused their lamps to save fuel. Dogs barked at nothing and then quieted. The Warlords guards lounged in their positions, AK-47s across their knees, more worried about rival clans than about distant Americans. Above them, too high to hear, the drone tightened its circles, its infrared sensors studying every rooftop and courtyard for unexpected movement. When the helicopters finally lifted from the American base, the night swallowed their sound within minutes. If it is in English, use a clear, natural American English accent. If it is in another language, use a clear, natural accent for that language. Read it at a normal pace. Pilots followed routes that kept them low and away from known Taliban lookout points, weaving through valleys that generations of Afghan fighters had believed impossible by anything but mules. Inside the aircraft, red interior lights cast a faint glow on American flags sewn to body armor and on Afghan patches displaying eagles, swords, and the word commando in proud letters. As they approached the landing zone outside Kamal Kel, the gunship arrived overhead, invisible insurance against any sudden resistance. The drone operator, sitting at a console far from Afghanistan, reported that the compound's courtyard was quiet. Only a few heat signatures moved along the village's narrow paths. The major gave a final nod to his team leader, and the assault force prepared to step from the relative safety of the helicopter into the dangerous calm of the Afghan night. The warlord still believed he controlled this valley, and for years that belief had been enough to keep villagers and rivals in line. But on this night, as American and Afghan soldiers moved like dark shapes toward his compound, that illusion of control was about to be shattered by a tactic that turned his greatest ally, the cover of darkness, into the very thing that betrayed him. A few minutes after the helicopters touched down in the darkness outside Kamal Kel, the warlord's fate was already tilting away from him, and he had no idea. The assault force moved out in two files, Americans and Afghan commandos spreading into the fields like shadows, guided by faint infrared beams that only their night vision goggles could see. Above them, the gunship orbited in pitch black, its sensors reading the village in heat and light while its cannons waited silent, a promise of overwhelming American firepower if anything went wrong. The team leader, a U.S. commando, Army captain, kept his voice low over the radio as he directed squads toward their positions around the compound. Each soldier knew his role from hours of rehearsals on a mock-up built back on the base. Every doorway and courtyard memorized long before they stepped into the real village. The Afghan commandos, who had grown up in places like Kamal Khel, pointed out narrow footpaths and low walls that did not appear clearly on the aerial imagery, helping the Americans adjust in real time without losing momentum. Inside the Warlords' house, the last of the evening's visitors had gone home. He sat with two trusted lieutenants, talking quietly about money, weapons, and a shipment of explosives due to arrive in the coming days. Around the compound, a half-dozen guards slouched at their posts, rifles leaning within arm's reach, their attention more on whispered jokes than on the dim horizon. They believed that if any danger came, it would arrive in the daylight as a long, dusty convoy, easily spotted from miles away. The first sign that this night was different was not a sound, but a command. A loudspeaker in Pashto boomed from the darkness just beyond the main gate. The Americans and Afghan government forces were outside, the house was surrounded, and everyone inside was ordered to come out with their hands raised. For an instant, the compound froze. Then the warlord jumped to his feet, shouting for his men to grab their weapons, convinced that a bluff must be met with defiance to preserve his reputation. What he could not see were the Americans already stacked along his outer wall. Explosives in place on the gate, rifles steady, every movement drilled to muscle memory. The captain gave the order, and the night exploded in white light and flying dust as the charge ripped the wooden door from its hinges. In the same second, flashbang grenades burst in the courtyard, turning the world into blinding light and deafening noise for anyone inside, while the assault team surged through the smoke. For the Warlords' guards, it felt as if the walls themselves had betrayed them. Men who moments before had been dozing in the shadows now clutched at rifles, stumbling and disoriented, their eyes unable to adjust as green-eyed figures in helmets and body armor poured through the entrance with absolute confidence. The Americans moved in teams, each covering a different angle, while Afghan commandos shouted instructions in the local language, ordering women and children to stay back and pushing terrified bystanders into safer rooms. In many night raids across Afghanistan, no shots were fired at all because speed and surprise broke resistance before it started. If it is in English, use a clear, natural American English. But one of the warlord's lieutenants chose to raise his rifle toward the dark shapes entering the courtyard. Two disciplined bursts answered him, dropping the man before he could pull the trigger, the American fire controlled and precise even in the chaos. The warlord himself tried to escape through a rear doorway, pushing aside a curtain into the narrow alley that ran behind his home. There, he met another American team already in position, having slipped around the compound minutes earlier based on the detailed layout learned from captured couriers. A bright green laser settled on his chest, and a calm voice in Pashto ordered him to kneel. The sight of multiple rifles, all steady and unwavering, cut through his bravado in a way years of rival threats never had. As plastic cuffs tightened around his wrists, the warlord looked around and realized something that would be repeated in hushed conversations among his allies for months. The Americans had moved faster in the dark than he and his men could have moved at noon. They had known exactly where he slept, where his guards stood, and which doorway he would choose when panic drove him to run. The very night he had always trusted to hide him had become the stage on which American power played out with frightening precision. While one team secured the prisoners, other soldiers began methodically searching the compound. Laptops, phones, notebooks, and weapons were tagged and bagged as evidence. Each piece of information another thread for the intelligence analysts who would be awake before dawn, turning this raid into leads for the next one. Hidden in a storage room, they found cash bundled in rubber bands and spare radios marked with frequencies that matched those used to trigger roadside bombs along the nearby highway. Outside the compound, villagers watched from the shadows as the Americans worked, many of them too afraid to step closer. Others silently relieved that a man who had ruled them by fear was finally in restraints. The Afghan commandos spoke with elders, explaining that the target was a commander responsible for attacks that had killed innocent people as well as soldiers. For some listeners, the message was comforting. For others, it only deepened the mystery of how the Americans always seemed to know so much about their private world. Within an hour, the helicopters were back, rotors whipping dust into spirals as prisoners and seized equipment were loaded aboard. The assault force withdrew as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind only broken doors, scorch marks, and rumors that would grow larger with every retelling. In the minds of many Afghan warlords, each successful American night raid like this one added another layer of fear. If they could strike here, without warning, where else could they reach? Back at the base, the captain debriefed his team while intelligence specialists immediately began combing through the captured phones and documents. Already, new names and locations were appearing on the screens, hinting at another network of fighters, another valley, another compound where men believed themselves safe after sunset. The success in Kamal Khel was not the end of anything. It was a link in the long chain of operations that kept relentless pressure on insurgent leaders during the war in Afghanistan. For the Afghan warlords who heard about this raid, the message was clear and deeply unsettling. They could reinforce their compounds, hire more guards, and threaten villagers all they wanted, but the Americans had showed they could remove a powerful man from his bed in the middle of the night with almost mathematical efficiency. From that point on, many of them slept more lightly, knowing that the sound of distant rotors might one day be coming for them as well. In the weeks after the raid on Kamal Khel, the story of how the Americans had taken the warlord in the middle of the night spread far beyond that single valley. Traders carried the tale along dusty roads, adding details with every retelling. How the helicopters had appeared without warning. How the guards had been blinded before they could lift their rifles. How the commander who once boasted he feared no man had been marched through his own gate in plastic cuffs. Around cooking fires and in cramped tea houses, other warlords listened and imagined their own compounds under the same ghostly green gaze. For U.S. planners, the mission was one success among many in a broader campaign. Night raids, paired with intelligence gathered from drones, informants, and intercepted communications, had become a central tool in the effort to dismantle insurgent networks across Afghanistan. Commanders could point to maps where once unassailable areas were suddenly missing key Taliban leaders, each removed in operations that took hours instead of months. In provinces far from Kamal Khel, other warlords tried to adapt. Some ordered their men to sleep in different houses each night, never using phones and traveling only under heavy escort, hoping constant motion would keep them ahead of American intelligence. Others dug deeper into villages, surrounding themselves with civilians as a human shield, betting that the United States would hesitate to risk innocent lives even in a precise kill or capture mission. Yet the fear never fully left them. They heard that, in Wardak, multiple Taliban commanders who had ruled their districts for half a decade were suddenly gone after a string of night operations. They knew that in some areas, U.S. Special Operations Forces and their Afghan partners were hitting multiple targets in a single evening, using helicopters like taxis that ferried them from one compound to the next until dawn. Each whispered report reinforced a single message. America might not control every road in Afghanistan, but it could reach into almost any bedroom. For the American soldiers who executed these missions, the picture was more complicated. Many understood that these raids were among the most effective ways to keep pressure on Taliban leadership while avoiding the large battles that could cost dozens of U.S. lives. At the same time, they could not ignore the human details. The frightened faces of children caught in the bright glare of their flashlights. The shaking hands of elders forced to kneel while compounds were searched. The women who cried silently as doors were breached yet again. Veterans later spoke of how those images stayed with them long after they rotated home. For every successful capture of a bomb maker or commander, There were nights when bad intelligence or a misread gesture turned a tense encounter into tragedy, something American units tried hard to prevent but could never completely eliminate. Many of those who served in Afghanistan's Special Operations community carried a dual memory: pride in having protected their comrades by striking enemies in their beds, and a heavy awareness of the fear those operations left behind in ordinary Afghan homes. Yet among the warlords and hardened insurgent leaders who had long used terror as a weapon, the psychological tables had unmistakably turned. Men who once moved freely at night now consulted the sky before every journey, wondering if a circling drone had already marked their vehicles. Some shifted meetings to caves and remote ravines, abandoning their comfortable compounds not out of humility, but because they no longer trusted their own walls to protect them from American reach. In private discussions, U.S. officers described this as one of the quiet victories of the war in Afghanistan. The raids did not promise to transform the country overnight, nor could they guarantee political outcomes in Kabul, but they forced insurgent leaders to live with constant uncertainty. Every hour they spent hiding, every night they moved instead of planning freely, was an hour in which American patrols and Afghan civilians faced fewer coordinated attacks. Years later, after the final U.S., if it is in English, use a clear, natural American English, and the political situation shifted in ways many veterans found painful to watch. The memory of those nights remained powerful among the men who had once been hunted. Former Taliban and warlord figures, now more comfortable speaking in public, still referred with unease to the era when the Americans owned the night, a phrase that said as much about fear as it did about tactics. They acknowledged that for a long stretch of the war, the most dangerous hours were no longer when they advanced, but when American helicopters whispered overhead and boots they could not see moved through their courtyards. For American veterans of those night raids, the legacy is complicated but unmistakably tied to courage and professionalism. Many remember the discipline it took to enter unfamiliar houses in total darkness, relying on training and technology rather than anger or panic, and to distinguish real threats from terrified civilians in the space of a heartbeat. In interviews and reunions, they described not just the adrenaline of breaching a door, but the quiet pride of knowing that their actions removed dangerous leaders while often keeping their own casualties remarkably low. In the end, the story of America's night raids in Afghanistan is more than a sequence of operations on a map. It is the story of how a superpower used precision, intelligence, and small groups of highly trained volunteers to challenge men who had long believed themselves untouchable in their own strongholds. For Afghan warlords, those years rewrote the meaning of darkness itself. No longer a shield, but a reminder that somewhere above the clouds, someone was always watching, and that if the Americans chose to come, they would come when fear was deepest and resistance weakest.